Sure. First name is Tung, T-U-N-G. Last name is Yin, Y-I-N. And I'm a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School.
And then can you talk a little bit about what's going on right now with court orders and the Trump administration?
Um, so I guess so the quick, really short summary is do we have a constitutional crisis? And so up until now, it's always been understood that Congress has its powers, the president has their powers, and then the courts have their powers. And within shared areas, there may be sort of power struggles. But when courts issue an order, the understanding is that you have to follow the order. Now, you can appeal the order from a trial court if you think it's wrong, and that goes to the appellate court. And then if the appellate court agrees with the trial court, you can ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. But ultimately, when the courts have sort of decided this is it, this is what the result is, that we understand that presidents and their high-level officers have to obey the orders. And so what we're seeing now is sort of, are we crossing a line where the president and or these cabinet officials are actually ignoring court orders, or are they taking, hyper technical readings of the orders that sort of allow them to say that we're not really defying the orders? One example would be the person who was sent to the El Salvadoran prison, um, where the government has conceded that they did not respect a particular immigration order not to send him to El Salvador. So the Supreme Court finally said, okay, you have to facilitate his return, which leaves maybe a little bit of wiggle room. I think most people would understand facilitate means, you should do what you need to do, and we expect you to bring this person back to the United States. But it's not quite the same as saying you must bring this person back. Maybe the Supreme Court used that word facilitate because they were hoping that the Trump administration would indeed just say to the El Salvadoran president, hey, send this dude back. Um, but leave some room where, they don't actually have to confront the 100% clear result that the president is defying an order. But, at some point, all these other cases that are bubbling up will present some issue where we're going to have a clear ruling and there won't be this kind of little bit of wiggle room. And when that happens, the question is going to be, does the Trump administration continue to do what it can not to comply with the orders? And where there's no more wiggle room, then not complying really becomes outright defiance. And then we do have clearly a constitutional crisis at that point.
Am I missing anything? This is so far the only case where this has come up, right? There's no other cases where there's a court order that's being potentially not taken up.
Well, no, there was the other one involving the Venezuelan undocumented immigrants who were shipped out of the country, and in that case, the district judge had said orally in court, okay, stop this, and if there are planes in the air, you need to bring the planes back, and that was not done, and so that's the contempt order that's going to proceed may proceed forward. It's the one where the judge has said that he believes there's probable cause to believe that the administration has violated his order. But basically, it's all this shock and awe strategy by the president that he's taken so many of these executive orders that have gone in so many different directions to reshape the law, and they're all being challenged and at various stages of litigation. And so the other one we see that's far along is the birthright citizenship executive order, where the government the three separate district court judges have stayed that order and issued nationwide stays. The administration wanted the nationwide stay to be lifted, which would mean that only the parties who brought those three lawsuits would be protected against the executive order, and everyone else would be subject to its terms. The Supreme Court refused to lift that stay in a 9-0 vote, but they've signaled that, I mean, they're going to take the case and decide on the merits, meaning that is this executive order actually lawful? Which I think most people are predicting it's going to be a pretty clear no as the answer.
going back to that contempt of court in the Venezuelans case, when is that ruling expected? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, basically, so this is criminal contempt, not civil contempt. Civil contempt is we call it coercive in nature, but it's not punishment. In fact, it's your profession that gets subject to it, where a reporter has a source. You don't want to give up the source, but the judge says we need to know who the source is for this litigation. The reporter says, "I'm sorry, First Amendment allows me not to disclose it," which the Supreme Court has said that has to give the journalist right has to give way in where there's critical needs. So basically, if the reporter won't burn the source, the judge says, "Okay, I'm holding you in contempt of court, but you hold the key. The moment you want out, you give up your source and you get let out of detention." Criminal contempt is punishment. It's not trying to get the person to agree to do something. It's I gave you this order, you disobeyed the order. Now it's time for punishment, and it has all of the protections of criminal trial. So right to counsel, confrontation of witnesses, and so forth. And so within that, the initial threshold is, does the judge think there's enough of a basis to go forward with the criminal contempt? And we call that probable cause is the standard. So the judge in this case has said, I think there's probable cause to move forward with this, but he hasn't decided to do so yet because there's some tricky questions. Who exactly would be named as the defendant or defendants?
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
Yes, and then who's going to prosecute the case? Normally, you would refer to the Department of Justice, but of course, here that's probably not going to work. So, can the judge appoint a special counsel, and who would that be, and so on?
That's
So,
confusing.
yeah, I think in your email you're wondering, like, or no, in the call when you called me, you're wondering, like, who would be the defendant? Has this happened before? I mean, I cannot remember a time when a president has been held to stand trial in a criminal contempt proceeding. And the recent Supreme Court case on presidential immunity probably means you wouldn't be able to do that, because what you would be holding the president accountable for would be presidential actions within the core of the presidency, even if they're ultimately deemed unlawful, probably going to be shielded by that particular immunity ruling. But the other point is that who is the order directed to? Because the person who has to obey the order is who the judge says, you do this. And by analogy, what we've seen in the past has been contempt of Congress, not the courts, but Congress. And in those instances, it's usually the cabinet official who's the highest level person. So Eric Holder, who was President Obama's attorney general, was held in contempt by the Republican Congress, or Republican-controlled Congress. There was a Secretary of the Interior under President Bush who was held in contempt of the democratically controlled Congress at the time. So most likely in this situation we're talking about, it would be basically, whoever the head of ICE is, or going all the way up to Homeland and maybe DOJ would be who would be the targets of the contempt order. So probably not the president.
Are the consequences of contempt of court versus contempt of Congress different?
Yes, because of course Congress doesn't have the power to sanction the way that the courts, or punish the way the courts do.
But the court could potentially punish a executive of a certain office, ICE, etc.
Yes. Now, of course, could the president then commute or pardon the person? Somewhat of an open question, but probably yes, because the pardon power is pretty broad and it's still ultimately a considered federal offense.
So this is fairly new territory from the history that you know, and definitely the history that I know. What does this do for the public's understanding of our judicial system?
I guess you could think of it as like a quick and dirty bit of law school that you follow this and you learn a bit about how the Constitution works or doesn't work, and we'll have to see what ultimately happens if it does proceed to a criminal contempt. or is there some sort of resolution where the Trump administration officials start to yield a bit in their obstinance?
Um, Going back to the student visa situation, so far there haven't been any, so far all of these have been reinstated when a judge says reinstated. Do you see any potential for this to take a similar turn, or do you think this is a pretty clear cut, if the judge says reinstate it, they're going to reinstate it?
Who knows with this administration?